Welcome back, guys. This week we're talking about why you're stupid and nobody likes you. Triggers. What we're talking about today, emotional triggers. See what I did there? I'm just so clever, aren't I? Triggers. Something happens out there. There's some inciting incident out there, and this causes some sort of emotional reaction inside of you. You are triggered by something in your environment. So what's the real cause of being triggered? Is it the inciting incident out there, or is it something within you? You know, I see a great example of a trigger that I've seen or I've heard of is people who have panic disorder, some sort of at least mild panic disorder. When they're in a building in wintertime, you know, they're all dressed up and they start to get really warm, they'll actually start to have a panic attack, because that's what happens when you have a panic attack, is you begin to get warm. So you're there getting warm with your hat and gloves on in a building, and you think, oh, this must be a panic attack, and you may actually have one. Now, what caused the attack? Was it the warm building? Is that what caused it? Or was it some issue in you? I guess I'm pretty much giving you the answer. Another example of a trigger is when women test men. Women make men uncomfortable, perhaps, maybe sometimes consciously, but I think mostly it's done on an unconscious level because they're trying to see who the man really is, what issues he is hiding. If you needed to find out if somebody was a liar, would you just ask them if they're a liar? Or would you put them in a situation where lying would be beneficial to them and then see what they do? And that's what a test is. We're trying to find out, or women are trying to find out what's going on in a man's unconscious. And that's ultimately what a trigger is. We think that the incident reveals the trigger, or we think that the incident causes the trigger, but the incident in truth reveals the trigger. There's something going on in you, some weakness, I would say, to use the vocabulary that we use here, some unconscious emotion. That's just for reference. I'm gonna draw another map here. So what happens when you're triggered? There's an incident out here, and this reveals something in our unconscious. A weakness here, and we glob onto this. A weakness here, a weakness there. And when I'm talking about a weakness, I'm essentially talking about not a weak point that you have, but at least an unacknowledged weak point. So maybe a common test that a woman would give a man is, oh, I don't date guys who are poor. I only date guys who have a lot of money. I mean, does she actually just want to date a guy who has money? Maybe. But I think most of the time, she's just bringing up the money issue because what? A lot of guys are insecure about money. So if a guy presents like he's really confident with money, that doesn't mean anything. That could just be a persona. That is essentially a smoke screen filling up a hole in your boundary. And yeah, so these weak points project out. I know I diagrammed this a little bit on a projection video. These weak points project out, create these holes in our boundary. This is unconscious. This is how our unconscious presents itself, and we're going around thinking everything's okay. Then we walk into a warm building and we start to get warm, and then what? We have unconscious anxiety we have not handled, so we may begin to panic. Another great example of a triggering scenario happened this past week in Washington, D.C. Some kid, 16-year-old kid, maybe not a kid anymore. I mean, it's kind of biased when you say he's a kid. He's a 16-year-old. He went through puberty. Still technically a minor. We can at least say a minor. Was smirking at an indigenous people's banging on a drum, and we think he must have been bullying him. It turns out that wasn't the case, but simply that picture of that, let's just call him a privileged kid, what we would say, I mean, I don't like that word, privilege, because it implies that you're somehow taking resources from somebody else. A discussion for a whole other video. Some sort of privileged kid, I'm thinking like a New York Times writer now, some sort of privileged kid smirking at the underprivileged. Oh, this represents everything wrong with our time. Or does it? Did you just reveal your own insecurities? And that's the gift of the trigger. That's why, we think we want to avoid these. In fact, it wasn't in my department, but at my old school, a fellow TA was teaching a class on Ovid. I forget, maybe it was Roman literature or something like that. But there are a lot of rape scenes in Ovid, and there was a trigger warning in the class syllabus. Hey, if you have a past with men committing violence against you, this is mainly for women, of course, then beware, or leave. Don't be in class that day. No, it's important to be in class that day because when triggers come along, we say good, right? Now that we know how our unconscious works, we want to be triggered. We want our weak points to be revealed to us. We want a girl to say, I only date guys who have this much in their bank account, especially when we don't have that much in our bank account, because it gets us to reveal our weak points to us. It reveals our holes in our personal boundary created by the weak point. And by weak point, I specifically mean, again, our latent emotions. And I would say if we're talking with anger, it's typically latent, or with triggers, did I just say anger? When we're talking triggers, we're specifically talking latent anxiety. Yeah, those New York Times writers who saw that smirking kid looking at the First Peoples, what are they saying? And some of them come out to admit this. I was beat up by a kid like that in high school. Now, are you triggered because you were beat up by that kid, or are you triggered because you haven't resolved that issue? Who's really making you feel weak? Is it that kid who beat you up in high school, or is the fact that you have yet to resolve it? Because you're probably in therapy, but you don't understand the purpose of therapy, because the therapist you go to doesn't understand how emotions work, let alone even what emotions are. Or maybe you didn't get beat up by a kid like that. Maybe you watched enough movies from the 80s and 90s where all the bad guys in those movies, I'm thinking of Karate Kid, the first one. The second one, they were Chinese, but in the first one, they looked like that kid, that smirking kid in the MAGA hat. So this brought up a lot of issues that you have. This brought up a lot of resentment, perhaps. And you put it on that situation, but really, it was about you. Now we have journalists recognizing that this is a problem. That journalists, on the whole, had mostly, a negative reaction to that picture. So some journalists are coming out. I had just heard Barry Weiss at the New York Times. Actually, I like her. There are some good New York Times writers. And she says, hey, we got to be aware of this. We have to, when we get triggered, we can't let it affect us. No, that's not how it's going to work. To not let a trigger affect you, you look at yourself, you look at your unconscious, and you realize, what's going on with me? And this isn't just about the MAGA hat wearing kid. This is about any trigger that we have. You think that the girl asking you or telling you that I only date guys with a certain amount of money in the bank account, you think that's a problem with her. That is a weakness for you to work on. And you'll go to PUA forums and they'll give you responses to tests. But what does that do? That just makes it appear like you have a boundary, makes it appear like you're in touch with yourself when you're not. And it's worse than unhelpful. It's damaging, because by giving you a trick, when Barry Weiss says, hey, journalists, just ignore the triggers, just give yourself don't actually look at the cause of it, just ignore the symptoms. You are cutting yourself off from yourself. Yeah, you're cutting yourself up here off from yourself down here. When in truth, the real way how we handle trigger, whatever happens to trigger us, is to look at our unconscious. And when we're out on a date and a girl says, I don't like guys who are short, I don't like guys who have bald spots, whatever it happens to be, and we feel that warm feeling of panic, perhaps like the person who has panic disorder walks into a warm building in the winter, we go, oh good. Thank God for this beautiful creature in front of me to reveal my weaknesses to me. What an opportunity. Even if this doesn't work out, even if I mess this up, who cares? It's not about this one situation. It's ultimately about, everything's ultimately about the money I make, the relationships I have. Well, that's what money is. It's about your relationship with that thing. It all comes down to how I relate with myself. How I can get in touch with my weakness. And that's why we have triggers. To show us what's going on, at least to give us an indication of what's going on. Thank you for watching, guys. Like and subscribe. Tell a friend. Go out and talk about this with your friends, especially friends who you disagree with, especially friends who have different opinions than you have, for the purpose of triggering yourself as much as you possibly can.